T.R. Reid is the Washington Post's Rocky Mountain bureau chief, and he has become one of the nation's best-known correspondents through his coverage of global affairs for the Post, his books and films, and his lighthearted commentaries on National Public Radio. Reid took a roundabout path to the Post. He majored in classics at Princeton University and subsequently worked as a teacher, as a naval officer during the Vietnam War, as a lawyer, and a few other jobs along the way. At the Washington Post, he has covered Congress, national politics, and 4 presidential campaigns. He has spent most of the past decade overseas as the paper's bureau chief in Tokyo and in London. Reid has written and hosted documentary films for National Geographic TV and for the A&E network. He has regular commentary on NPR's Morning Edition. He has served as a visiting professor at Colorado College and the University of Michigan. He has been a member of the Board of Trustees at Princeton University and serves on the Board of Advisors of the University of Colorado Medical School. Mr. Reid has written 6 books in English and 3 in Japanese, and translated 1 book from the Japanese. His latest book, The United States of Europe, our current book of the semester, was published by the Penguin Press in November 2004 and has become a national bestseller. T.R. Reid has been married for 32 years to the attorney Margaret McMahon. They have 3 children. As Mr. Reid was speaking to a group of high school students this morning, we've put him to work. He spoke to AP European Studies students this morning at Orem High, students from Orem and Provo and Mountain View and other local high schools. He was telling them that he currently has 3 children in 3 very prestigious universities. Those are my words, not his. His words were how expensive that is for him. So we're looking forward to his eldest child's graduation. He told me he feels like he'll be getting a raise when that happens. So please join me in welcoming Mr. T.R. Reid.
Hello, everybody. My publisher has asked me to point out to you that my book makes great spring giving. Remember, I got 3 kids in college. I have to be shameless about this. I'm just delighted to be back at the Y. I've always loved this university. I just love the Wasatch Front, and as if just being here weren't enough, I want to point out to you that yesterday morning I flew in here early and got off the plane, called Snowbird, and they said 17 inches of fresh powder, and I was out there in an hour. It's phenomenal. I think they will yank my Colorado driver's license if they hear me say this, but it was better than any day I've had in Colorado all season. It's great. Awesome. You guys were in class at the time, but I was snowboarding. And of course, I would never admit that I fell or anything in all that powder. Of course, that wouldn't happen, but some strange thing happened and I lost my voice. I don't know why that would be, so I'm sorry about that. It's fantastic for me as a person who spent a lot of time overseas. I've written several books about trying to tell Americans about the rest of the world. It's fantastic to come to the Y. This amazing school where I think 70% of the students have had an experience of living overseas. Now there's just nothing to match that. That's phenomenal, and I tip my hat to you for doing it, for the reasons you did it, and for the knowledge you brought back. And as Jeff said, I'm on the board of Princeton, pretty highfalutin university. About 6% of our students have ever lived overseas. So just look at the advantage here, and look at the wealth of knowledge, and I want to say particularly the language schools represented in this undergraduate school, because the fact is, in every country I've lived in overseas, the Americans who had the best language skills were the LDS people. Somehow or other, you guys really learn your language as well. And I have a very good friend, Clay Chandler, who learned his Japanese on the hill over here at the Missionary Center, and I think was the best American Japanese speaker I've ever met. In fact, he was so good that I hired him for the Washington Post. So there's another reason I have to thank the Y. I know the faculty, having talked to the faculty, they're incredibly proud of the international experience of their students, and it adds a lot to, there's just certain basics that they don't have to go over. So I think for somebody like me who's traveled around the world, it's fantastic to come here and see this group of people who've seen the rest of the world. And of course, you then see the virtues and the faults of other countries, and I feel, certainly in our case, whenever we've come home from overseas, it's made us better Americans. We just have a better appreciation of the wonder of our country and the way that we, probably better than anybody in history, have melded different races and cultures and creeds into a single community. It's not perfect, but it's better than anybody else has done, and I feel that acutely whenever I come home from overseas. I tip my hat again to the Kennedy Center for picking this book of the semester and looking at the list of books that they've chosen. I gotta tell you, it gives me an inferiority complex. I don't know if you know this, but journalists have an inferiority complex towards academics. We feel shallow. We feel they really have a depth of understanding in the field that we don't get. We do sell more books than they do, but still, it's somewhat unsettling to be before academics talking as a journalist. I do wish I had had a chance to be here. I feel quite flattered that you picked my book for Book of the Semester, since I'm not an academic. I wish I'd been here for the faculty forum on my book. I've seen some excerpts from it on the net, and it seems that the faculty bashed away at me pretty good. That's fine. Hey, bash away. I don't know how many of you have had this experience, but when I write books, you know, sometimes they get good reviews. Sometimes there's some blockhead who fails to understand the brilliance of my work and lets me have it. This happens. And when I get a bad review, it only happens about as much as I fall on my snowboard, so I'm not saying this is common or anything, but when I get a bad review, the person in our home who really gets mad about it is my spouse. You know, she just announces it. What does he know? He's an idiot. And my view is different. I mean, I write the books and throw them out there. Bash away. You know, that's why I threw it out there, to get people talking and thinking. And so let me just say here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to race through this introduction to the EU today and then bash away. If you disagree with me, let me have it. If you agree with me, tell me that too, but you can let me have it. One of the reasons that I'm glad you picked my book as Book of the Semester, one of the reasons I'm glad there's a Kennedy Center and that so many of you came out here to hear me on this beautiful, I think it's now a spring day, isn't it? It was a winter day for a while, but that you would come out here on a temporarily sunny day in Utah to hear me talk about Europe. Just the fact that you're here pleases me, because just coming here and studying this shoots down one of, I think, the most vicious European stereotypes about our country. You know, everybody has stereotypes. We have our stereotypes of the French or the Germans, and they have their stereotypes of ours, and they love their stereotypes and are bound to them. I used to fight them hard in Europe, but it's hard to convince people that conventional wisdom is wrong. And one of the things that every European knows about us is that Americans are insular, that we're ignorant of and indifferent to the rest of the world. We really don't care. And I think the Europeans believe this very strongly. Perhaps some of you ran into this when you were overseas. You know, they say, oh yeah, the Americans, they have their World Series. Their World Series, and they only let 2 countries compete in it, right? Very American kind of thing. Do you know how an American speaks French? He says the same thing in English, only louder. That's what the French comedians always say. And when I was in Europe, I combated this argument all the time. I think it's completely wrong. I think Americans have even at universities that don't have 70% of the people with international experience, the United States just knows more about the rest of the world than most other countries, because the United States, I don't think there's any doubt about this, is the biggest collection of races and creeds and cultures and national backgrounds and languages that has ever been collected anywhere in the world. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I used to say to the Europeans, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. You know, when they elect a new prime minister, in Vietnam, hundreds of thousands of Americans tune in and want to know who it is because they follow that country, many more than anybody in Europe does. This is, as I say, it's hard to combat stereotypes, but I used to go around Europe, give speeches, give, interviews, academic seminars, write articles and say, no, you're wrong. Americans are not insular, but it's a hard case to make. So one day I was in my office in London, and I got a call from Oxford University from a student who's the chairman of the Oxford Union, which is their famous debating society. It's been around for 200 years. Like 20 of the presidents of the Oxford Union have gone on to become Prime Minister of Britain. It really is a breeding ground for future British leaders. And what they do is they have a debate just about every week on some topic, and they have a couple of speakers argue it, and then the students vote, yes or no, or we approve or we disapprove, whatever. And it's interesting. I thought it was kind of quaint the way they voted. They have, of course, it's Oxford, so they have this 700-year-old building where the Oxford Union is. And after the debaters, the way the students vote is they stand up and walk out either this door or that door. This is the yes approved door, and this is the no disapproved door, and they count the people going through the doors. That's how they count the vote, which I thought was kind of quaint and ancient. And then, of course, as many of you know, it turns out that's exactly how they vote in the British Parliament. Did you know this? After they debate the bills, everybody stands up and walks out. It's not because they're bored or leaving. It's because they're walking through the door to be counted. And everybody in Britain will tell you the story about Churchill, when Churchill was the conservative leader, gave this fiery speech for his bill. And then he went over to his buddy on the Tory side and put his arm around his shoulder and said, "Hi, Bill, how are Deborah and the kids? How are things going at your summer home? How are your horses?" And meanwhile was steering him through the yes door, to win the vote, kind of thing. Anyway, they do this at the Oxford Union. So this president of the Oxford Union calls me up and says, "Mr. Reid, I wonder if you'd come up to the Oxford Union and debate. We are going to debate this topic. Resolved, this House condemns the ignorance of the United States of America." Right? You're damn right I'll argue that one. We're not ignorant. Yeah, I'll be there. So I showed up to the Oxford Union, and this very nice, junior or something, sophomore, who's the president of the Oxford Union, comes to the door. "Oh, Mr. Reid, thank you so much for coming up here. We really appreciate it. And, just to be polite, I just want to tell you something in advance. You're going to lose." Right? Because one thing the kids at Oxford University know is that we're all ignorant. They know that for sure, and they don't want anybody telling them different. So I went in to make the case. Now, how would you make this argument that we're not ignorant, that we're not an insolent country? Well, one tempting way, I guarantee this doesn't work, but it was always tempting to say, hey, if we're so stupid, how come we're the richest, most powerful nation in the history of the world, right? That one doesn't work, believe me. The Europeans don't like that one. So I tried, it's Oxford, so I tried a slightly more sophisticated line of attack. So here's my argument. What do you mean insulated? What do you mean insular? Americans have more connection to the rest of the world than any other country. Like, for example, you have the Royal Geographic Society. It's right on Hyde Park there. And the Royal Geographic Society has about 20,000 dues-paying members who have joined the Royal Geographic Society. We have the National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C., 10 million dues-paying members. We're 1,000 times more interested in the world than you are. Get this, says I. When they have an election in Poland, so many Americans care, so many Americans pay attention. I don't think two people in Britain could even name the candidates for prime minister in Poland. In Poland, 80% of the political contributions to the parties come from Americans. They care so much. Of course, they're American, they vote here, but they care enough about other countries in the world to get involved in their politics. Nobody in Britain does that. And now here's my killer. What do you mean insular? Do you know that in the 2000 census, 125,000 Americans reported that their first language in the home is Cambodian, or Hmong, the Cambodian. I said, I bet there are not 125 people in all of Britain who speak Cambodian. It's a pretty safe bet, and There's nobody in this hall who speaks Cambodian. That's a safe bet in Oxford. It may not be at BYU, but at Oxford that was a pretty safe bet. So don't tell me we're insular. We know more than you do about the rest of the world. So what do you think? Pretty good? I thought it was pretty good. No, they rubbished me. They ripped me to shreds. The other debater was George Galloway, who's a very lefty Scottish member of Blair's Labour Party, very left. And he just ripped me to shreds. He just went after me in this very elegant Scottish way, you know. And he said, and as for Mr. Reid's Cambodian speakers, they imported them. Like that's cheating or something, right? I'm sad to say I and we lost the debate because it didn't matter almost what I said. The Europeans know that a gathering like this of people coming out on a sunny afternoon in Utah to hear somebody talk about contemporary Europe, they just know that couldn't happen. You're not interested enough to be here. And this is a key part of a great European pastime, America bashing. Those of you who have lived in Europe, I'm sure, have seen this. They love taking us on. I put a lot of examples about it in my book. I covered it a lot as a journalist. I feel as a journalist that we should see ourselves as others see us, that it's useful to know what they're saying about us. And I covered a lot of it, and I put a lot of it in my book. Most of it, you know, there's a germ of truth in it. Most of it, I think, is wrong. I do think, and I think it's important to realize this, that Europeans, I think, do recognize and appreciate the big virtues of our country. I think even, you know, the most lefty anti-American French scholar will agree that we are open to new ideas. We have a youthful vigor and openness to innovation, to new ideas and new people. Like nobody else. And I think everybody recognizes the intellectual vigor and the youthful love for innovation that marks America. I think they really get that. I think they all get the meaning, the genuine, substantial meaning of the Statue of Liberty, that we have opened our arms to people from all over the world, because when you travel Europe, particularly in the eastern half of Europe, everybody there has a cousin or a nephew or a hairdresser or a grandson who has emigrated to Provo or Tallahassee or Portland or Chicago, and they're getting letters home from people saying it's pretty good over here. So I think they do recognize that, but they love to go after us. Now, one thing where they do bash us, and I think maybe they're right, is the Europeans feel dissed by us. They feel that we haven't paid enough respect to what they've achieved, to this geopolitical revolution the Europeans have pulled off in the last 50 years, because they really have changed their continent in an amazing way. They've reversed history. This is a continent, as those of you who studied Europe know, it's a continent with hundreds or thousands of years of animosity, of warfare, of nationalism and hostility. And in the last 50 years, the Europeans have really come together. They've gone beyond that hostility and formed a union built on the notion of international cooperation, borderless agreements, everybody part of the same family. These are new ideas, really, for Europe, and they've made it work. I say in my book, I think it's true that Europe is more united today than any time since the Roman Empire. Of course, the Romans did it by sheer force of their military legions. Today's Europeans have done it by agreement, by election. They've come together, and they're proud of it. I don't know to the extent you know this, but Europe today has a president, it has a parliament, it has a constitution, it has a Bill of Rights that applies to everybody on the continent. If we have time, I'm going to go into this Bill of Rights, because in interesting ways, it's more expansive than ours. They have a court system that can overrule the highest court or the parliament of any member state. Europe has a single antitrust czar who is so powerful that she was able to force Microsoft to rewrite Windows. Our own antitrust division couldn't do that. Europe's antitrust czar is powerful enough because she's running the biggest single market in the world to do that. Europe has today a common passport, common license plates, borderless travel. They don't have border guards anymore. And as you know, of course, 12 European nations have thrown away their liras and marks, pesetas and francs, and adopted a common currency. And the result is, let's see if we can, oh yeah, look at that. Oh, I screwed it up, didn't I? Well, you saw that map for a second, right? Oh, geez, how did I do that? Anyway, about a year ago, I made an auto trip from the Arctic Circle. What do you think? Can you get it? There it is. You can't even see the whole trip I made on this map. From the Arctic Circle at the top of Finland, Europe is so united today that you can do the whole thing by car or train because they've built tunnels across the sea and tunnels through the Alps. They've spent hundreds of billions of euros on connections. That's part of this coming together. I drove from the Arctic Circle down to here, to the Med at the southern end of Spain. I went through 8 countries, never changed currency, never saw a border guard, never got a stamp in my passport. Now this ticks me off. I like getting all those visas stamped in my passport. But this doesn't happen in Europe anymore because Europe has come together. I think it's also true that Europe has developed a single culture, or is clearly developing a single culture, and this is particularly true among the people you might have known when you were there. The people known as Generation E, these are Europeans from what, 15 to 40. They have a very continental mindset, a continental view of the world. They may be from Edinburgh or Toledo or Tallinn or Lisbon, but before they are Scots or Estonians or Spaniards or Portuguese. They're European and they feel this. They have the right under this Bill of Rights that I mentioned to live, work, study, vote, and run for election in any European country. If you live in Estonia and you want to go to college in Spain, you can for free. You live in Italy and you want to go to college in Ireland, fine, it's free because you have that right. And this group is known, as I say, as Generation E because these are people who see Europe as their home, not the individual country. Any of you seen this really nice European movie, L'Auberge Espagnole? This is the Generation E movie. This is a movie about Generation E people. Incidentally, did you know they're making L'Auberge Espagnole 2? It's going to come out in the fall because it was so successful among these young people. There's also an American teen gross-out movie about this. Do you know this movie, Euro Trip? Have you seen this movie? Stupid American teen gross-out movie, but it's about 4 American teenagers suddenly discovering that they can travel anywhere in Europe because it's now united in a way they weren't before. I think it's very clear that this new united Europe has a common language. Do you know what it is? It's English, that's right. The French don't like it, believe me. But the language of European t-shirts, baseball caps, posters, brand names, text messages, email is English. And this is true in surprising places. If you go into a post office in Belgium, Belgium is a country with 3 legal national languages, German, French, and Flemish, which is basically Dutch. But you go into a post office in Belgium, and on the wall you will see the slogan of the Belgian Postal Service in English: Belgian stamps are cool. You figure it out. If you watch MTV Europe, which I'm sure many of you did, MTV Europe, about 85% of the songs are in English. The band may be from Poland or Estonia or Ireland or Italy, but they're singing, well, they're rapping. It's largely hip-hop, so I can't understand it anyway, but largely in English. And they play, you know, it's MTV, they play a lot of American bands, which are quite popular in Europe, but one day of the year, on May 9th, which is Europe Day, that's the national day for the European Union, that's their 4th of July, one day of the year, MTV Europe recognizing that this is Europe Day, they won't play any American bands. They play only European bands, which is hard for them because their fans really like American music. So they cheat. So here's what they do. You know, Madonna and Gwen Stefani have both married Brits and moved to London, so they call them European. So if you want to see the Just a Girl video, turn in on May 9th and it'll be there. I think the Europeans want recognition for what they've achieved. And as a matter of fact, last month they got it. If you saw, the Bush administration made a big push on Europe. Condoleezza Rice went to 10 countries, Donald Rumsfeld was there, and President Bush went. He became the first president of the United States of America to pay a state visit to the headquarters of the United States of Europe. He had a summit meeting with Mr. Barroso, the EU president, and spent hours with the EU cabinet and said everything the Europeans wanted to hear. He said, we respect the way Europe has gotten past its ancient animosities and come together. We like a strong, united Europe, and we want to work with you on our common interests. Man, that was perfect. It's just what they wanted to hear. Because, you know, in the first Bush term, there was a completely different attitude. In the first Bush term, the administration's attitude towards the EU was divide and conquer. We'll work with London, we'll work with Madrid, we'll work with Warsaw, and the countries you don't like, to heck with them. We'll ignore them. And Brussels, it doesn't even exist. It's not even on the map. That was their attitude. I think this was exemplified when Secretary Rumsfeld was asked, why are so many Europeans against the war in Iraq? And as you know, he said, well, there's old Europe and there's new Europe. And we're going to divide them, was the implication. We're going to work with new Europe. Now, Condoleezza Rice, Don Rumsfeld, and George W. Bush have all said, no, we recognize that Europe is a single place. We're going to deal with Brussels, not with the individual states. And Rumsfeld, I think, said it brilliantly. He's so charming, you know. And he was in Munich in February, and of course the Europeans said, well, what is this business about old Europe and new Europe? What are you talking about? What are you trying to divide us for? And Rumsfeld said, well, let me just say the Secretary of Defense who made that comment was the old Rumsfeld. Pretty good, I think. Pretty good line. And the new policy, I think, is to deal with Europe, so they like that. I think one reason the Europeans are so proud of what they've achieved in coming together and forming a union is that the reason for it, at least one of the reasons for it, is totally noble. They formed this union to move past their ancient hostilities in the name of peace. Because if you look at European history, there's just hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years really, of brutal warfare. And particularly in the 20th century, or at least in the 80 years from 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, to 1945, the end of World War II, 3 brutal wars on the European continent that got most countries involved at one time or another and left tens of millions of people dead. I mean, you really, it's hard almost to estimate how many people, including perfectly innocent civilians, were murdered in these wars, killed in these wars, for what? At the end of each war, they were nowhere ahead of where they'd been before, except in rubble and in cemetery space. And if you look at Europe in the fall of 1945, just after, in the total rubble and destruction of World War II, it was very easy to see they were going to do it again. They had gone to war every generation. Every 25 years, they wiped out a new generation of young men in war, and you could see they were going to do it again. I mean, the Iron Curtain was falling across Europe. These countries were rebuilding their armies faster than they were rebuilding their cities. It didn't take a lot of foresight to see what was going to happen. And a group of visionaries, many of them driven, incidentally, by moral, religious concerns, said, no, we have to prevent this. We can't have World War III on this continent. We just can't do it again. We have to find a way to avoid this. Well, how are you going to avoid it, said the skeptics. You've done it for centuries. You've done it for millennia. It's the way Europe works. And these visionaries said, well, let's build a new Europe. Let's find a new way to organize our ancient continent. One of the people saying this was Winston Churchill. Churchill, as you know, pretty much single-handedly geared up the British people and the British Empire to fight Europe, to fight the Nazis, I mean, at a time when all of Europe had fallen to Hitler, when the United States was still neutral. You know, in 1940, when Hitler was bombing civilian neighborhoods in London every night, we had an ambassador in Berlin sipping champagne with the Fuhrer. But Churchill was there galvanizing the West to fight against the Nazis and led this fight, pulled us into it. And on May 8th of 1945 was VE Day. The Nazis surrendered. Churchill was vindicated. He had won. He had single-handedly galvanized the world to fight the Nazis and won. And as I think you students of history know, 3 weeks later, the British people gave him their thanks. They had a national election and voted him out of office. They dumped the Tories out of office and elected the other party. And you know, you can defend this. Okay, Churchill was a great war leader. The country was now in rubble. You needed a new party to build a new Britain. You can see the argument. Couldn't have been that good an argument because Churchill was then re-elected in 1953. But this meant that Churchill had time on his hands, and he spent this time thinking about what he called the tragedy of Europe and this bitter past and bitter future. And in 1946, Winston Churchill gave two famous speeches about this. One is the one that every American knows. He went to Fulton, Missouri, and said, from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, an iron curtain has fallen across Europe, dividing the continent, and he predicted the Cold War that was to come. I think this was the first time, really, that Americans woke up to the fact that Joe Stalin, our ally in World War II, was now dividing Europe. But the speech that the Europeans know from Churchill is a speech he gave in Zurich about 3 months later, in which he said, "I come today to speak to you about the tragedy of Europe." He said just what I've told you. We've had these 3 brutal wars, one every generation, and you can see we're going to do it again. We may not even get a whole generation before the next one, unless we change. We need a new model. And you know, Churchill's mother was American. He loved our country. And he said, we need to model our new Europe on the great republic across the shining sea. That's how he spoke. And he said, we have to build a United States of Europe. And, you know, this idea, in a war-torn continent, this idea just caught on like wildfire. You can see it caught on with me. I used it as the title of my book. And one of the really striking things about this new Europe that has emerged since about 1950 is that it worked. They've now gone 60 years without a war between European countries. You go to Europe, you've been to Europe, you can see there's not going to be a war. They really have found a way to break this pattern of repeated national wars. And I say in my book, we ought to tip our hat to them for that. That is worth honoring, and therefore, that's why they were so pleased when President Bush and Condoleezza Rice went to Europe last month and did recognize that achievement. However, it's not all noble and glorious, because there are other reasons that brought the Europeans together. Little things like, you know, greed, power, money, stature, things like that. Because if you go back to the end of World War II, these European countries had basically run the world for 500 or 600 years. They had global empires. They had the most important industrial and financial centers in the world in Europe. They were the political leaders of the world, and suddenly, at the end of World War II, guess what? They're not very important anymore. All the European powers are now kind of minor planets orbiting around an American sun, and guess what? They didn't like it. They didn't like it. But they could see, I think if you're French or British or German, in 1946, you can see very clearly that your country is never going to be able to stand up to the industrial and financial and political clout of the United States of America. But if you're France and Germany and Spain and Portugal and Italy and Sweden and Finland and Estonia and Ireland, yeah, together they can. And if you look at this new Europe today with 25 nations in it, just look at the numbers. Europe has more people than we do, 470 million. It has more wealth than we do, more GDP. It has a lot more trade than we do with the rest of the world. The Europeans give more money in foreign aid to more countries than we do. They give 70% of the foreign aid going around the world. Let's assume they do that because they're nice people and they care about the downtrodden, but giving foreign aid is also a way to buy power in the world, to buy political clout, and they've done that quite successfully. We do it too. I'm not, you know, everybody does that. And although, as I told you, you drive through Europe today, it's one place. In Europe, it's one place with one culture, or coming to be one culture. Lo and behold, when they get to the World Trade Organization or the United Nations, there are 25 separate countries again, so they outvote us on every international body. And that amounts to clout in the world. An interesting thing about, and this is what the Europeans want, they constantly talk about building a second superpower, building a new superpower. The term that kind of European academics use is the counterweight thesis. They're going to be the counterweight to American power in the world. One place, though, where they're not going to counter our force is in military power, because they've made this interesting bet that you can be a superpower in the 21st century without military power. Be very interesting to see if they can pull this off. They certainly have the political and financial clout, but they don't have military power and they don't want it. I don't think, there's not an army in Europe that could beat the Indiana National Guard if it came to that. And they don't want that kind of power. They're not into military power, as I said, partly because, you know, the whole reason they came together was to get beyond war. They look at war as kind of a costly anachronism. Another reason is they don't need to worry about the military because they have a big, strong brother who's paying for their defense, and that's you and me. American taxpayers, we're paying 70% of the cost of NATO. We have 100,000 American soldiers based in Europe to protect them against what? Can you tell me? I can't tell you, and I'm laying myself up here as an expert on Europe, and I don't know why we have soldiers over there. Anyway, so they don't have to, but the other thing is the Europeans don't want to spend money on the military because they would much rather spend their money, and believe me, they have very high soak-the-rich taxes. They'd rather spend their money on their welfare state, which is amazingly generous. Europe is a place where you go to college for free. You know, this business of American parents have to save up 140, 150,000 to send a kid to college. They have to go on the road and sell their book. Did I mention my book? To pay for college. A German, a Swedish, an Italian, a French parent doesn't have to do that. The kids go to college for free. Europe is a place where the doctor comes to your house and you never get a bill. In many European countries, when a baby is born, the government pays a salary to either mother or dad to stay home with that child and take care of her for a year or two. And then, of course, the job is guaranteed when they want to go back to work. In any European country, as soon as a baby is born and for the next 18 years, the government sends a check every month of that child's life to the family to help raise the kid. This is called family allowance. In France, it's called child benefit. In Britain, it's called family benefit in Germany, but the idea is there. Guess what? This stuff is expensive. You can't have a welfare state of that dimension if you also have a warfare state. If you have a big military, they can't afford it. So that's another reason why they don't want to have it. They have made the decision. They don't mind paying taxes. Believe me, they pay very high taxes. But they don't mind it because they have a different attitude of the relationship between government and the people. They think government is there to be the people's friend, to help you out, to get you through the vicissitudes of life, to get you through the nice parts of life, for that matter. And you can't carry that off if you have to spend on a military as well. Of course, there's an interesting question whether the Europeans can continue this welfare state at all, because they have what's known as the demographic time bomb. That is very low birth rates. The Europeans make very good cell phones, great cars, good fashion, good cheese, good wine, but the one thing they're not making that nobody else can make is European babies. They're just not having children, and the result is an aging population, and they don't have the young workers to pay the taxes to support this welfare state. It's a serious problem. I think the solution is there in the form of immigration from Africa, from the Mideast, even from East Asia, people who want to come into these rich countries and get those good jobs. And the fact is, because it's borderless, once you're in any European country, they can move pretty much anywhere they want to find the jobs. To me, that's a good thing. I happen to like immigration, but a lot of Europeans are very upset about this. They don't like it in the same way that a lot of Americans don't like illegal immigration, and they're against it. Now, here's the question. Do we care? Okay, so there's a geopolitical revolution taking place across the Atlantic. So Europe is more united than it's been in 2,000 years. What do Americans care? What does it matter to us? The fact is, as I said, the Europeans want to create a power that can be a counterweight to the American model in the world. I think they're very eager to do this, and they're doing it. And I think Americans need to wake up to both the threat and the possibilities posed by this new force in the world that is there, although I think many Americans didn't understand it. And we need to deal with it. It used to be said, in fact, I still hear this all the time. I heard it today, as a matter of fact, when I was talking about this book in Orem. Europeans, a bunch of lazy socialists, they take 6 weeks of vacation a year. We don't have to worry about them. Come on. Well, as I argue in my book, in many areas, these lazy socialists have done pretty well. If you take, for example, Motorola is a great American high-tech company, a great leader. And in about 1998 or 9, 3 European companies caught and passed Motorola in cell phone technology and in market share in cell phones right at the time when the global market for cell phones was taken off. Today, our champion Motorola ranks 3rd in the world in cell phone sales. A Finnish company has twice as much market share as the United States. You know what company this is, of course, Nokia. This is Finland that has by law, they have by law 5 weeks of vacation a year. Nokia gives its citizens its employees 6 weeks of paid vacation a year. This is a very high taxes, big welfare state. It's about as lazy a socialist country as you could find, and they are trumping one of our champions. So please don't say to me that we don't have to worry about those socialists over there. It's not right. Finally, let me just make a brief mention about political clout. We had this statute in the United States, which is known as the Extraterritorial Income Exclusion Act, which is a fancy way to say a tax subsidy. If an American company sells an airplane or a car or a computer or a piece of software or some Utah coal or something overseas, our government excludes that income from taxes. You don't have to pay taxes on the export income. This means that our companies can price their exports lower and still make a good profit, and it makes it very hard for the foreign companies to compete. So guess what? Foreign governments hate this law. They hate it because it makes it harder for their companies to compete against us. They don't like this subsidy. And for years, foreign governments were writing letters. You have to go to class, that's fine. Be more interesting than my speech, I think. But they've been writing letters saying, please, please end the Extraterritorial Income Exclusion Act. China, Japan, Korea, Spain, Israel, Canada, a lot of our allies in the world have asked us to get rid of this subsidy. Does anybody think this worked? Of course not. Of course not. American business loved this subsidy. We're not going to change that. Here's what the United Europe did, the European Union. They control the World Trade Organization, which is the international trade cop. They went to the WTO and said, that American Tax Subsidy Act is illegal. So let's punish them and put big tariffs on their exports so they can't export anymore. And sure enough, the World Trade Organization laid hundreds of millions of dollars of tariffs on American products, and they made the amount of the tariff go up every month. George W. Bush said, this is outrageous, they can't do that way. They're starting a trade war. And the European Union Trade Commissioner is a fellow named Pascal Lamy, a Frenchman, incidentally. He said, oh, no, we're not starting a trade war. We don't want a trade war. That's not what we're about. We just want to repeal that American law. Now, I ask you, do you think a Frenchman has the right to repeal an American law? Anybody buy this? He certainly has the power. I don't think he has the right, but he certainly had the power. So many American exporters wrote to Congress saying, you got to do something about these tariffs that last October, just before they went home for the election, Congress passed the law, they repealed the law that Europe didn't like. Can I read you what the Speaker of the House had to say about this? Dennis Hastert. He said, my gut feeling, I really like this, my gut feeling about this is that we fought a revolution 230 years ago to stop Europeans from telling us how we have to tax in this country. Doesn't that sound right to you? He goes on to say, but the fact is we have to repeal this law. The EU has a sword to our head. We don't like it, but we have to do what the Europeans are telling us to do. This is my argument. To me, this is power. Yeah, they don't have military power. They're not as united as the United States of America, although they're getting there. But in terms of political, financial, cultural clout in the world, we need to face the fact that there is a second superpower, the United States of Europe. And because you came to hear me explain this, I'm grateful to you for coming to listen. And just by being here, as I say, you have shot down this bitter stereotype of our country that's common in Europe. So thanks for coming.